The next feller we're going to bring up is a feller that's become a good friend of mine. We didn't realize that we knew each other from a million years ago, but at least his wife, and yeah, that's what it was. But Michael Wagner is a very smart man, and I love listening to him. He's a historian, he's a political scientist, he's studied, and he just has so much to say. Would you welcome, please, Dr. Michael Wagner.
I got a special mic for tonight because I have to move around a bit. Thank you, Ben, for that introduction. Wasn't that music great? Yeah. So, unfortunately, it's kind of true what he said. It's kind of all downhill from there, at least as far as I'm concerned, because now you just have to listen to me talk instead of music. But so it's interesting, his final song, something's got to change, and I think that's the attitude of most Albertans. Most Albertans realize there's something wrong with our country. Most Albertans realize that the situation of our province is not acceptable. We need something to change. But for most Albertans, the change that they would like is actually to change the country so that Alberta could fit within Canada, so that our voices could be heard in the national government. That's what we'd really like to have. Like when the Reform Party, the original slogan was "The West wants in." Like that's what most Albertans would really want. Why can't our voices be heard in the national government? That's what most people really, that would be the hard cry of most Albertans. The problem is we can't have what we want. We want to have our voices heard in Ottawa, and we cannot have our voice heard in Ottawa. We can't have the option that we really want. So that we really only have two choices. One is to live with the status quo, and the other is to become independent. The Reform Party worked so hard to try and get our voice heard in Ottawa, and it just didn't work. And so, in my view, the only choice we have is independence, because we're not going to get any kind of change that we really want. Now, to understand this, we really have to look over Alberta's history. Now, the Prairie provinces, right from the very beginning, like 1905 when Alberta and Saskatchewan were formed, right from the very beginning, we had various grievances with the federal government, and we fought with the federal government. We would often create new political parties, like the United Farmers of Alberta, or the Progressive Party of Canada, or the Social Credit Party. We'd create our own parties to fight for our interests within Ottawa. But eventually, we came to the point where we realized we needed to become independent. Like, none of those early parties talked about Alberta becoming independent. We were trying to fight our way within Canada. But what changed was in 1968, a man named Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister of Canada. And because after Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister, that's when the first movement for independence really started in Alberta. Because he started making changes to this country that Albertans could not tolerate anymore. Now, one of the things he did was to unleash an attack on Alberta, unprecedented in Canadian history. No federal government has ever attacked a province the way the federal government attacked Alberta under the time of Pierre Trudeau. In 1973, the price of oil had started to skyrocket because there was a war in the Middle East. We'd had oil, from the time of Leduc discovery in 1947, but from 1947 until 1943, the price of oil was often only about $2 or $3 a barrel. So although it was good for our province, we weren't raking in a whole lot of money. But in 1973, there was a war in the Middle East, and the price of oil skyrocketed. And Pierre Trudeau brought in what was called the export tax on oil. So when Alberta exported oil to the United States, as we'd been doing for a long time, the federal government take a huge portion of that revenue from our oil revenues, even though that was a provincial resource. Alberta was supposed to get that money, but the federal government was taking a huge amount of that money through the export tax. And our premier at the time, Peter Lougheed, called the export tax on oil the biggest ripoff in Confederation's history, because it had never been done like that before. So throughout the 1970s, Peter Lougheed fought with Pierre Trudeau over Alberta's oil resources, but things actually got worse in 1980 when Pierre Trudeau brought in the National Energy Program. Now, the National Energy Program devastated Alberta's economy. It destroyed businesses, it destroyed thousands of jobs, and devastated the lives of thousands of people. So many people lost their jobs and their homes at that time. And actually, when I was traveling last year, I talked to 3 separate people who said they knew of people or knew people personally who committed suicide at that time because of the devastation in their lives because of the National Energy Program. And I've met several other people who would talk about, how their fathers lost their jobs or their homes because of the National Energy Program. This was a deliberate policy of the federal government in 1980 and 1981. Now, 2 of the main reasons the Liberals gave for instituting the National Energy Program was to get energy self-sufficiency for Canada and to Canadianize the oil industry. Like, the federal government thought there was too much American oil ownership of the oil industry, and they wanted to Canadianize the oil industry. So those are two of the main publicly stated reasons. But those weren't the real reasons, and we know that later because Marc Lalonde, who is the energy minister who instituted the National Energy Program, a few years after he was out of power, he gave an interview where he admitted that those weren't the real reasons. And this is what he said to our journalist. This is Marc Lalonde. These are his words. The major factor behind the NEP wasn't Canadianization or getting more from the industry or even self-sufficiency. The determinant factor was the fiscal imbalance between the provinces and the federal government. Our proposal was to increase Ottawa's share appreciably so that the share of the producing provinces would decline significantly and the industry's share would decline somewhat. So the real purpose of the National Energy Program was for the federal government to confiscate much of Alberta's wealth. I mean, that's what we thought at the time, but they wouldn't admit that till afterwards. But I want to repeat that this is the only time in Canadian history when a federal government attacked a province that way. Alberta is unique in being the only province that has been attacked so significantly by the federal government. Now, the pent-up anger towards Trudeau would subsequently contribute to the rise of the Reform Party. Like, the main reason for the rise of the Reform Party at the time that it did was, of course, Trudeau resigned in 1984. To make a long story short, Brian Mulroney won the 1984 election. We thought he was our guy because all of our MPs were progressive conservatives in Mulroney's government, so everything was going to turn out well, we thought. But what Mulroney did was, like, Canada had recently bought the CF-18 fighter jets at that time, and those CF-18 fighter jets had to be maintained, and it was a very big government contract to maintain the CF-18 fighter jets. So there's only two cities in Canada that could do that, Winnipeg and Montreal. So the government held a competition to see which of those cities could do the best, and Winnipeg won the contract according to the government's criteria, so Mulroney awarded the contract to Montreal because he wanted the votes in Montreal. So that that led to, like, so much anger in the West that Preston Manning created the Reform Party of Canada. But much of the background to that was the anger already at Trudeau from the previous things that Trudeau had done. Now, the Reform Party, their emphasis was trying to get the West to have equal treatment within Ottawa. Like, we had not been treated equally up until that time. So, but instead of trying to get the West out of Canada, like I mentioned, the slogan was "The West wants in." We could have our voice heard in Ottawa if we could get constitutional changes so that our voices could be represented there. So in 1983, the Reform Party won 52 seats in the federal election, and in the 1997 election, it won even more seats. And yet nothing was done. Like, we did elect our Reform Party MPs and send them to Ottawa for several years to have our voice heard there, but their voice was not heard. Ottawa ignored the concerns of our Reform Party MPs because Ottawa does not want to listen or will not listen to what Alberta wants. And there's a quote I have here from a couple of academics, Roger Gibbons from the University of Calgary and Loline Berdal from the University of Saskatchewan, and they wrote about why the Reform Party's message was ignored in Ottawa, and this is what they said. The Reform Party's clarion call that the West wants in was widely derided outside the West as narrow regionalism, unsuitable to a truly national party. Indeed, the party system has helped define regional in the case of the West, and the West alone, as somehow antithetical to national. Parties based largely in Ontario and Quebec are self-defined as national, a definition generally accepted by the media and elite political discourse. Parties based largely in the West are defined successfully by their opponents and the media as regional. The West is the only Canadian region earmarked in this fashion, and the only region with interests assumed to be at odds with the national interest, whatever that might be. So that's why the Reform Party's message was ignored in Ottawa, because the interests of the West are defined as being antithetical to the national interest. We're considered to be outside the national interest, so their message was ignored. Now, one of the things that the Reform Party tried to do was to reform the Senate, but there's also a separate Senate reform movement. And this is important when we're looking at the history, because going back to the 1970s when Peter Lougheed was fighting with Pierre Trudeau, Peter Lougheed created a Citizens Advisory Committee on the Constitution to recommend to the Alberta government the kinds of changes to the Canadian Constitution that would allow for Alberta's voice to be heard within Ottawa. And on that committee was a University of Calgary law professor who recommended changing the Senate. He convinced the other members of the committee that if he could reform the Senate so that senators would be elected, right now, because senators are appointed still by the Prime Minister, if we could have a Senate where the senators are elected and there's an equal number of senators from each province, then our voice could be heard within the national government. So that started the Senate reform movement. So in 1981, the Canada West Foundation, a very famous think tank in Calgary, published a proposal for Senate reform called Regional Representation, the Canadian Partnership. It was written by three prominent citizens, one of whom was Senator Ernest Manning. And Ernest Manning had been Alberta's longest-serving premier, and then later he was appointed to the Senate. So he was one of the authors of this proposal. And the whole purpose of this, of course, was to reform our national institutions so that there could be a voice for the West within the national institutions. It was a way of getting Western voices heard within Ottawa. And so this is a popular idea in Alberta. And so in 1983, the Alberta Committee for an Elected Senate was created. And then the idea of a reformed Senate spread to Saskatchewan and BC, so they changed the name of it to the Canadian Committee for a Triple E Senate, because it was proposing a Triple E Senate. Now, the idea of a Triple E Senate, there's 3 E's. One, as I mentioned, the senators would be elected. Another E was that there'd be an equal number from each province, as I mentioned, and the third E would be they'd have effective powers so that the Senate could block activities from the House of Commons that were contrary to regional interests. So that was the Triple E Senate idea. Now, the Alberta Progressive Conservative Party, which was our ruling party at the time, endorsed the Triple E Senate idea in 1984. Then in 1985, the Alberta government's Special Committee on Senate Reform also endorsed the Triple E Senate idea. And later in that same year, in 1985, Don Getty became a Premier of Alberta, and he endorsed the Triple E Senate idea, and then he actually created a Senate Reform Task Force to promote the Triple E Senate idea right across Canada. And then in 1989, October 1989, Alberta held the very first Senate election in Canadian history, and that was won by Stan Waters of the Reform Party. So for the very first time, there was an election for candidates for the Senate. Stan Waters won that election, and Brian Mulroney, our Prime Minister, actually appointed him to the Senate, as it was expected. Now, so we kind of had momentum towards the Triple E Senate, but that momentum basically stalled at this point. But it did pick up a little bit again later because, the Reform Party ended up becoming the Canadian Alliance in 2000. And then in 2002, Stephen Harper became leader of the Canadian Alliance. He merged the Canadian Alliance with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to form the new Conservative Party of Canada. Now, Stephen Harper had been a Reform Party MP, and he actually personally really believed in Senate reform. So when he became Prime Minister in 2006, he actually used the powers that he had as much as possible to try and reform Canada's Senate. So he was elected early in 2006. In May of 2006, his government introduced a Senate reform proposal into the Canadian Senate, and Stephen Harper actually testified to the Senate committee looking at that proposal. And it's very unusual for a Prime Minister to testify to a Senate committee, so it just showed how much he was actually committed to that personally, Stephen Harper was. So then a few months later, his government introduced a Senate Reform Party into a Senate Reform Bill into the House of Commons. Now, both of those bills died, but later they would continue. Harper's government would continue to introduce more bills into the Senate and the House of Commons in attempts to get Senate reformed in Canada, so that in the first 7 years in office, there were 3 Senate reform bills introduced into the Senate and 5 introduced into the House of Commons, because he was really trying to get this done. But the Quebec government was opposed to the Senate reform proposals that Harper was trying to accomplish, so they initiated a reference case to the Quebec Court of Appeal to see if what Harper was trying to do was constitutional. Now, when Harper saw what the Quebec government was doing, he decided to do a reference case directly to the Supreme Court of Canada so that his government could be asking the questions of the Supreme Court that would kind of do an end run around what Quebec was trying to do. So Stephen Harper sent the reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada asking about Senate reform, and to make a long story short, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled any kinds of changes to the Senate, even the kinds that what Harper wanted to do, could only be implemented by a constitutional amendment. Now, a constitutional amendment is so difficult that essentially put an end to the Senate reform movement in Canada. So here, let's just look back at this. So here we see a man, Stephen Harper, very personally committed to Senate reform, and he's Prime Minister, and he was thwarted every step of the way. The opposition parties opposed Senate reform. The Senate itself opposed Senate reform. There were people within his own Conservative caucus who opposed Senate reform because they were from Central Canada or Eastern Canada. Many of the provincial premiers opposed Senate reform, and of course, in the end, the Supreme Court of Canada opposed Senate reform as well. So Stephen Harper, a man who is committed to constitutional reform to benefit the West, he became Prime Minister of Canada, and over several years, he used every tool at his disposal to try and reform the Senate. But he could not prevail in the face of intense opposition from Central Canada. So I say, if Stephen Harper, as Prime Minister, could not reform the Senate, then it cannot be done. And if Preston Manning and the Reform Party could not get the West's voice heard within Ottawa, then it can't be done. Albertans must realize we sent very good people to Ottawa to fix the system, but the system could not be fixed. Spending the next several years trying to reform Canada's Constitution will end in failure, as it always has in the past. Now, if we look back and we have to ask, what more could we have done? Like when you look at what we did with the Reform Party over several years and several decades with the Senate reform movement, what more could we have done really to try and fix Canada? What more could we have done? So we've tried all that and it doesn't work. The game is over. It's time for Alberta to secede from Canada and become an independent country. Thank you.